When one of the nurses finally knelt down and opened the bag, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Wrapped in a damp, torn cloth was a baby boy, cold, motionless, but still alive. And no one there knew yet, but that child was the son of a young woman who had been raised among verses, pulpits, and promises, the daughter of a pastor who could never have imagined that his grandson would be reborn through the jaws of a stray dog. And for a moment that lasted longer than any miracle ever preached on a Sunday morning. Everyone stood still, frozen between horror and awe, because they knew this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a story that would shake the very foundations of their faith. It was a strange kind of dawn, one of those that blend the skin-cutting cold with the suffocating weight of everything that goes unsaid. The city seemed swallowed by a dense kind of apathy, with street lamps blinking like tired eyes and distant truck horns echoing over empty bridges, like wandering souls crossing concrete without knowing if they'd ever make it home. Between damp alleys and streets that felt suspended in time, a figure moved, shoulders hunched, footsteps dragging, and a weight in her gaze so invisible and yet so crushing that her eyes no longer cried, because they had already wept all they could. Her name was Melissa Hart, only 24 years old, and yet she carried the look of someone who had already tasted ruin and the silence of unanswered prayers. The daughter of a rural preacher, raised in a church where God's love always seemed conditional upon obedience, Melissa grew up between memorized Bible verses, long skirts, and unnamed sins. But there was hunger in her spirit, hunger for air, for choices, for a path that didn't come tangled in guilt. So she ran. To the city. To be free. To become someone. But freedom to her came wrapped in invisible walls. It came in the form of loneliness on the sidewalks, of glances that pierced without seeing, of doors that slammed shut without ever asking her name. It came with a moldy room, unpaid bills, and lovers whose sweet promises turned to blocked numbers and silence. When she found out she was pregnant, Melissa trembled, but for a fleeting, fragile moment, she also smiled. She believed maybe this small life inside her was a sign, a chance to do things differently, to love without conditions, to raise something untouched by the world's poison. For weeks, she talked to her belly, sang to it, caressed it, gave it names, imagined clean bedsheets, a quiet hospital, gentle hands holding hers, but none of that ever came. The father disappeared before the first ultrasound. Hunger began to prowl. The rent expired, and with it, the last ounce of dignity she still held. On the eve of her delivery, Melissa knelt in a public restroom, her knees freezing against cracked tiles, one hand cradling her swollen belly, the other gripping a crumpled, torn adoption pamphlet with a number that never picked up. She cried like someone drowning, screamed without sound, felt the world shrink around her until it became a box made of concrete and despair. And then, she gave birth alone, in an abandoned building, with clenched teeth, a trembling body, and no witnesses, no applause, no one to say, "It's going to be okay." For hours, she stayed there, holding the baby in her arms, feeling his damp, cold skin against hers, hearing his weak little cry, his eyes still shut, so small, so helpless, so impossible to protect. And it was there in the half-light of raw pain that Melissa broke. "He's going to die with me," she whispered. "I can't even take care of myself." It wasn't abandonment out of cruelty. It was a gesture born from exhaustion, from paralyzing fear, from the feeling that the whole world had forgotten her, and that forgetting him, too, might be the only way to survive. With trembling hands, she wrapped the baby in a cloth she had once imagined would be part of his nursery. She found a trash bag among the debris, kneeled one last time, and murmured, "Forgive me." She left her son there, next to broken boxes behind a sleeping bakery, and she ran. Not from the place. She ran from herself. Across town, a dog wandered through the fog of early morning. his body covered in old scars, his fur burnt gold by the sun, and his nose trained to find what others had thrown away. Toby, the dog no one wanted. The soul who had learned to survive without expecting affection. He knew every alley like someone who maps pain across their own skin. That morning, he sniffed the ground with the precision of someone who had searched for food in places where only trash remained. But then he paused. His head tilted slightly. A sound. Subtle. Muffled. Movement. A bag. It shifted, but it didn't smell like food. It smelled like life. He approached slowly, as if afraid of being wrong. But he wasn't. Inside, a baby. Fragile. Curled. Barely breathing. And Toby, who had never had an owner, knew what to do. With steady, but careful teeth he grasped the edge of the bag, and even with his injured back leg he began to walk. In pain. Struggling. But with purpose. Toward the only place he remembered always having people, Mercer Hospital. The arrival was anything but discreet. Outside, an ambulance had just pulled in, its mechanical scream cutting through the cold dawn air. Paramedics were shouting codes and opening doors, trying to keep an elderly woman alive who no longer responded to touch. Inside, the hospital moved like a chaotic symphony, nurses marching back and forth like ants on fire, metal trays clanging, clipboards flying between trembling hands, monitors blinking like artificial hearts beating to keep that temple of hope and despair alive. And into that storm, Toby walked. No one noticed, or rather no one truly saw him. A receptionist nearly tripped over him, spinning around with a clipboard in hand. "Ugh, get out of here, dog," she snapped, without even glancing at what he carried in his jaws. She nudged him with her foot, a light kick, impatient, dismissive. Toby stumbled but did not let go. His eyes did not flinch, did not waver. There was a destination, and he would reach it. He veered off from the main entrance, found a side hallway, and entered. He passed the visitor corridor, then the empty waiting room with stacked chairs, then a linen closet. The bag hung from his mouth, swaying slightly, making a dull sound, like the weight inside was suspended between worlds. His steps were short but steady. His breath was loud. His heart raced, but he kept going, until he turned right and saw it. A door slightly open, soft light spilled out. Laughter. Women's voices. This was the place. The nurses' break room. 3 women sat in recliner chairs holding half-warm cups of coffee, trading complaints about the overnight shift and nervous laughs about difficult patients and never-ending charts, until one of them spotted something at the door. "What is that?" murmured the first, rising abruptly. The second gasped and backed away, hands in the air. "Oh my God. There's a dog in here. Get out, get out." But the third, Erin Walker, freshly graduated, her hair in a rushed bun, and the kind of eyes that had seen more pain than anyone her age should have, didn't move. Instead, she stepped forward. She looked into Toby's eyes, and for a single moment, longer than time, everything stopped. The light flickered. The clock lost meaning. The hospital's hum faded into nothing, because this wasn't just a dog. This was a plea, a cry without sound, a call for help hidden in a pair of worn, trembling eyes that begged, "Please see me." Erin took 2 slow steps forward. "Hey, it's okay, easy," she whispered, in a voice almost maternal. But it wasn't the tone someone uses to chase away an animal. It was the tone someone uses when they recognize a miracle. Toby gently placed the bag on the floor, then stepped back, as if to say, "My part is done. Now it's yours." Erin knelt, and it felt as though the entire world knelt with her. Her fingers shook, her heart pounded like a war drum. She opened the bag, and then everything disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. What she saw wasn't just a baby. It was a life hanging between 2 realms. Blue skin, colorless lips, a tiny, motionless body, but Warm. Still warm. Still there. Still possible. "It's a baby," she cried, her voice tearing through the air. "Code blue. Now. Get neonatal." "Now!" The calm room exploded. Trays crashed, a mug shattered, alarms screamed. Doctors and nurses stormed in like an army of coats and stethoscopes. They lifted the baby and ran, but Aaron stayed with Toby, still kneeling, still crying, still staring at the street dog who walked into a hospital without knowing how to read signs, but carried something holier than any Sunday sermon. She reached out her hand and Toby hesitated, but then, slowly, gently, he tilted his head and allowed the touch. It was the first act of true affection he had received in years. Aaron whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saved a life. You're more human than most people who walk through these doors." And in that moment, something broke inside her too. Something no one saw, but that would change everything. Because sometimes, the hand that saves comes from the ground. Sometimes, redemption arrives on four legs with weary eyes and a clean soul. And sometimes, the real miracle isn't found at an altar. It's found on the floor of a hospital, inside a trash bag, carried by an angel no one wanted. 3 months later. The city moved on, indifferent as always, blind to pains too small for headlines and too big for the heart to hold. It was late afternoon, and the sky was wrapped in a blanket of gray dust and silent regret. The breeze cut dry. Cars rushed past as if fleeing something. People stared at their phones, their watches shop windows but never inward, and there, in the darkest corner of a forgotten sidewalk, sat Melissa. She no longer begged for coins, no longer held up signs, no longer called out to anyone. She simply existed, curled inside a grimy blanket a volunteer had left weeks ago, her head resting against a cold brick wall, her face hollow, and her eyes staring into nowhere, like someone who got tired of waiting but couldn't quite leave. The pain didn't burn anymore. Now, it just weighed. That day Melissa wasn't looking for anything. But destiny, it seems, sometimes has ears when the heart has no voice. And something found her. A page of newspaper wrinkled by the wind stopped at her feet. Numb or curious, she picked it, unfolded it, read it. Stray dog storms hospital carrying abandoned baby in Blau and saves a life. The world spun. But Melissa didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't collapse to her knees. She just knew. The air grew thick, her throat closed, and her heart, nearly dormant for weeks, stirred. "It's him," she thought, without even thinking. "It's him. It's my son." The next day, Melissa did what she never believed she could do. She returned to the place where her world had shattered. The hospital. Each step felt like a crime. Each window, an accusation. The white facade, once a symbol of healing, now stood like a silent courthouse, where she was prosecutor, defendant, judge, and executioner. She walked past the entrance 3 times, hid her face beneath a dirty cap, wrapped a scarf around her mouth. Sweat slid down her spine despite the cold. But she couldn't go in. Not that day, not the next. But then again, what is persistence if not a sacred form of faith? Until one dull, misty morning, heavy with the exhaustion of identical days and weary hearts, the improbable happened. Not with thunder, not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a last breath slipping from someone who still wants to live. The sky, thick with clouds, mirrored her insides, gray, expressionless, stifled. And yet, she was there. Again. For what must have been the 10th time. Melissa pacing in circles in front of the hospital, like a shadow too afraid to enter her own fate. She was about to turn back. To give up. Again. To let the weight defeat the will, but then something made her stop. A window on the ground floor lit up, its soft glow slipping through thin curtains, like an invitation that didn't shout, but waited. Melissa froze. Her heart, for a fleeting moment, forgot how to hurt, and in a slow, almost sacred motion, she lifted her gaze like one staring at the altar of a guilt that never stopped burning. She took one step, then another, and walked toward the window with the ritual slowness of someone approaching a grave, but hoping what lies inside might still be alive. And then, she saw. Inside the scene was simple, but to her it was a universe. A nurse was smiling. In her arms, a baby. The baby. Her baby. His cheeks now flushed with color. His eyes, the ones she never really got to see. Open, alert, curious, alive. His small body wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his tiny fingers moving as if trying to grasp the world for the very first time. He was safe. He was warm. He was alive, even without her. And beside the crib, as a living symbol of something no words could ever truly explain, was Toby, lying still, serene, his body tired but his soul vigilant, eyes half closed, as if keeping watch, as if believing, as if fulfilling. A silent promise made long ago. Melissa pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Her breath, hot and trembling, fogged the window for a moment, but not enough to blur what was now carved into her soul. The pain she felt wasn't vague anymore. It had shape, it had a name, it had a face. And she cried. But not the ordinary tears of the weary or the guilty. This was older. This was ancestral. An emotional labor. A breaking of chains, a birthing of sorrow, a release of all the shame that had embedded itself into her, bones. As if the silence she'd carried for 3 months was now pouring out, not asking for forgiveness, but redemption. And this time, she did not run. She did not turn away. She did not flee like before. She crossed the street. Each step, a battle. Each breath, a sentence. Her chest trembled, but her feet had finally remembered where they belonged. She entered through the glass doors as if stepping into a sacred temple. The receptionists were distracted. A security guard glanced at her, paused, but something in her posture told him not to interfere. Melissa wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a mother returning. She was a soul saying, "I came for the part of me I left to die." Then the door to the break room opened, and Aaron appeared. They looked at each other, and for a moment, longer than any clock could measure, no words were spoken. But everything was said. Aaron didn't recognize the face. Time and grief had reshaped, but she recognized the eyes. More than that, she recognized the absence of peace. This woman was carrying something, and she needed to hand it over, not in rehearsed words, but in truth. Melissa tried, swallowed hard. Her voice failed. But then, with trembling lips and a soul torn open, she spoke. "It's him, the baby. I was his mother." The world didn't stop out of scandal. It stopped out of reverence. Melissa collapsed, as if her body had only now been granted permission to admit the pain, and the crying came, unfiltered, messy, but real. Each word a wound laid bare, cleaned, named. "I was alone. I tried. I swear I tried. There was no one, no door, no name, no arms. I gave birth like an animal on a dirty floor, listening to him cry so faintly. I thought he'd die with me. I thought maybe keeping him alive was worse than letting him go. So I left him. But I never stopped hearing that cry. Not for one night, not for 1 second. Aaron knelt beside her, and in a gesture that wasn't taught in school or training, she took Melissa's face in her hands, looked straight into her soul, and said, not as a nurse, but as someone who had once needed to forgive herself, "You came back, you're here, and sometimes, that's love too. Maybe the deepest kind, the kind that shows up even when it's ashamed." Melissa didn't take the baby home that day, or the next. But something inside her went home. She started visiting the hospital every Sunday at 3 p.m., always clean, always shaking. And little by little, something in Noah seemed to recognize her, her scent, her warmth, her hesitation. Toby, calmer now, always lay beside her, like a quiet seal on an invisible covenant, and Aaron watched from afar, knowing she was witnessing something rare, a miracle, not the kind that splits skies open, but the kind that softens hearts turned to stone. Today, Melissa lives in a small apartment that smells like beginning again. On the wall, a photo of her son with arms wide open. Beside it, a soft little dog bed, Toby's sacred corner. On the fridge, a calendar with a word written in bold letters, grace, because she learned that not all grace comes easy. Some cost sleepless nights, others require you to kneel on floors that once felt like courtrooms. But when grace finally arrives, it rebuilds what felt forever broken. And now she knows family isn't who never left, it's who returns, it's who stays, it's who sees, even when no one else does. And sometimes, it's a dog who stops and saves everything. Because sometimes miracles don't arrive with lights from heaven or choirs of angels. They come dirty, wounded, on 4 legs, carrying life where only death was expected. And sometimes, the most powerful sermon doesn't come from a pulpit, but from a quiet act, from a heart that refused to give up, from a dog who saw worth where the world only saw waste. This story isn't just about a baby being saved. It's about what can still be saved in us, even after the failure, even after the abandonment, even when no one else believes anymore. If this story moved you, share it. Someone out there might need to be reminded that redemption still exists, even in the darkest places. And if you've ever had to start over, leave a comment below saying, "I came back." Your courage might inspire someone else's miracle.